Alright, so this week we're going to use Screencast-O-Matic, and I'm going to put it on YouTube instead of Kaltura because Kaltura is not working for some reason. So here you go. We're going to talk about the end of the Middle Ages. We're going to call them the High Middle Ages. And they're going to end abruptly with the plague and a little bit of war. And then next week we'll talk about what flowers out of all of this. But between 1100 and 1300, the population in Europe goes up, and they began making large advances based on banking, cities, urbanization, architecture, farming, and so on and so forth. And you have in Europe by 1300 about 80 million people or so. And you also start to get universities in Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, and so on. And so there is light at the end of the tunnel by around 1300. However, what kind of stymies this will be the Black Death. And there are a lot of reasons for the plague and its ferocity that hits it. Firstly, it has to do with some of the weather. There are a couple very cold winters in a row in 1310 and very rainy summers, so the growing season was shortened, and also due to overproduction, the soil was eroding. So you start to get famine in about 1310, and so the nobles begin to squeeze the peasantry, and the state raises taxes. In between 1315 and 1322, millions of people die of starvation, and there really is nothing that anyone can do about it because that's just the way that things were back then. And so this is the beginning of kind of a prelude to what will become basically a century of warfare, disease, famine, and unrest. Now, let's get to the Black Death. This is kind of the precursor. Now, in 1346, the Mongols siege and take over a Black Sea port of Kaffa. If you can see it, it's right in the middle here. I'll point to it right there. Now, they not only damaged the old trading links, but they also unleashed an even more devastating invisible force, and what that is the Black Plague. So the Mongols probably picked it up in the Gobi Desert, where you can see in China there. And then they moved west, and then they overtook this city of Kaffa right on the Black Sea. However, some Genoese traders get out of Kaffa. They get on a boat, and then they head down the Black Sea, and then they head for Italy. Half were dead or dying by the time they got there. And those on shore, and they try to land on Messina, Italy here, and those who are on the shore look at this ship and they turn them back. Eventually, the Black Death is going to hit them anyways, but you could see what was happening because of the Black Death on this ship, and it spreads quickly. The captain kept trying to land the ship, but he kept being turned back. But as I said, eventually, because they get close enough to these ports that everybody in Europe is in some way, shape, or form going to be hit by the plague. It killed about a third of all total people in Europe. And it killed way more than, during this time period, way more even than the Mongols could even think of. And interestingly enough, the population of Europe did not get back to where it was before the plague for another 200 years. So this was absolutely devastating. So what is going on? It's pretty easy to explain. Well, excuse me. So what's going on with the Black Plague is what people in Europe are wondering. right, in 1350, in the 1350s. The Mongols are easy to explain. The Mongols have come and they've run through a lot of Eastern Europe, and they understand who the Mongols are. But every time the Mongols get close to Europe, something happens and they stop and they turn around. Now that's easy to explain, but the plague overthrew society. Um, and so what you get a couple different types of the bubonic of the plague. The first is bubonic, and that's vector-borne, meaning it came from fleas. It came from fleas who chew on rats that are infected by the plague, and then the fleas jump, and then they get on human beings, and that's vector-borne. Um, this had a 30 to 75% death rate, depending on where you were and if you got help, and just the basic idea is if you're lucky. It comes from the Greek word meaning groin, and so usually it started showing up in your lymph nodes of your armpits and your groins, and it travels through the lymph nodes in your body. And so vector-borne meaning from one animal to another by an animal, basically. There's another type called septicemic, which meant that it was a blood infection. This was basically 100% you're going to die. And it was very rare. And it was also very rare to be passed human to human. And this came with blood clotting and basically the idea that your blood gets infected and you die, right? Not a good way to go either. Lastly was the pneumonic, and that was more virulent than bubonic, but rarer, and that is a lung infection, or it is in the respiratory, and this is the one that could be passed by touching or through air. The bubonic plague was passed through fleas, which is what most people had. Septicemic was very rare, and that was very hard to be passed by humans. It would kind of blood-to-blood contact. And then pneumonic was the one where you could get past human to human the easiest, and mostly it was through air, right? So, no matter who you were, rich or poor, city or urban, urban or rural, there was a chance, not a chance, there was a guarantee that you in some way, shape, or form were affected by the plague in one way, shape, or form. Whether you had it, you knew people who had it, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of questions as to how it could have spread to Europe and how it could have spread so quickly. And there are different ideas. One is the climate that was in China at the time. The Central Asian steppes were really dry during that time period, so it forced rodents out of their usual dwelling place, and nomads as well had to move closer to civilizations in order to survive and to trade food with people who had agricultural areas. So that's one way that it could have been passed so quickly. The second is fairly simple. It's based on the economic and the political grid. It's like this map here. People were trading with the Mongol. Not only were the Mongols bringing it by land, but people were, once they got to Eastern Europe, then you're also trading by sea as well. Once it gets into the Mediterranean, everybody in Europe is going to somehow be touched by it, because most of the goods from the east landed in Italy, and then we'll talk about this next week, and then Italy were the middlemen, and they shipped it out all over Europe. So that's another way how it could be. The main route across Central Asia through the Crimea and the Caspian to the Black Sea, like Kaffa, and then on ships from there to Italy. Now, there are also secondary sea routes by sea from China to the Red Sea, um, across the Indian Ocean, through the Persian Gulf, and into the Fertile Crescent. So basically just this way, up this way. Just as easy to spread that way. So there's probably more than one way that it got there, but one thing is for certain, all routes terminated in Italy, meaning they all landed on Italy and then were spread out. Um, and so, like I said, everybody is vulnerable. No one is immune. Um, and just the whole idea that no one's immune is because of these major cultural realms that were now connected extensively through trade. Europe is one big, getting smaller through trade routes, and now you're getting Chinese goods as well. And I want to make sure that we know that causes were just unknown at the time, right? They just didn't know what was happening, and that's kind of what was so scary to them. Some of the symptoms is you died quickly, sometimes overnight, coughing up blood and oozing pus, and you would get really ugly black sores on your body, the size of eggs, and then those would pus, and then eventually you would die. And like I said, nobody really knew what was happening. Some said it was astrological. With unusual alignments of the planets. Many believed God was angry with them, and many compared it to the flood in the Bible and the end of days. No, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But the idea is they didn't know what was happening. You can't see fleas if you aren't looking for them, and even if you are, you've lived with them for so long, you don't really understand what is happening, right? But there are certain outcomes. Populations were devastated. Entire populations vanished. Um, the Chinese went from 120 to 80 million people over a century, which means they lost 40 million people, which means even with a higher birth rate, you're still losing a third of your population. Like I said, Europe was down a third of their population as well, anywhere from 19 to 38 million, depending on what you're talking about, die in the first 5 years alone. 19 to 38 million Europeans. Food production collapses. Famine often followed, thereby killing the weaker survivors. A lot of people would survive the plague and then end up getting killed by famine instead and dying of starvation. Right? What a terrible 2 years of your life. But the worst afflicted were the coastal towns and crowded cities, which had been hubs of trade, which is obvious. And so some major cities lost 2/3 of their entire population. And what also happens is many people start to flee. And so you kind of get this reverse urbanization. Instead of people moving to the cities like we usually have, the opposite is occurring. And this will push back a lot of intellectual, cultural ideas during this time period, trade, economy, medicine, and so on and so forth, because people were dying and there were other things to worry about, basically living. And so here's a picture of, he's probably in every horror movie, or in a lot of horror movies that you've seen, a picture of a plague doctor. And the beak was kind of like a rare, kind of like an early on gas mask that was supposed to help him make sure that he didn't get sick. Although we know now that most of the people who died came from the bubonic plague, which was transferred by fleas, rather than the pneumonic plague, which was transferred by air. So the gas masks, early gas masks, weren't really that effective. it was basically all luck. Either you got it or you didn't, and some people survived and most people did not. So what added to the people's misery were the ravages of war. One of the most brutal in European history up to this point pitted the French and the English against each other, and it's called the 100 Years' War. Since the Norman conquest of England, which we talked about earlier, in 1066, the King of England had held land on the actual European continent because it was a French person who was the King of England. However, after 1066 and after Philip and Lionheart and all of those famous people, French kings begin to chip away at all of the land that the English kings have in France. And by the beginning of the 14th century, England retained only a small area around Bordeaux called Guyenne. And in 1337, after a series of skirmishes, King Philip VI of France, whose dynasty we called the Valois, Valois, took over and declared Guyenne to be his. In turn, King Edward III of England declared himself King of France because his mother was French. So war began, and it really had two major phases to it. So you can see this green part at 1337. The green part in France is Bordeaux, and the place that we call Guyenne. So in the first phase, England gained ground, and a new political entity, the Duchy of Burgundy, allies himself with England, and it culminated when the English achieved a great victory at Agincourt in 1415. We don't really have much time to go into it, but this is a very important battle as far as warfare is concerned, and as far as the war. It's way beyond our scope. But if you are interested in doing something on the Battle of Agincourt, it would be an interesting PowerPoint. In the second phase, so England has the upper hand for quite a while, but in the second phase, things were reversed entirely with Joan of Arc. And you probably all know who, or at least have heard of Joan of Arc before. And there she is. So Joan of Arc, and a lot of people argue today, if it was not for her, France may not be known as what we know of it today. She is a patron saint of France, and she has been beatified, meaning recognition of going to heaven, and you can pray in her name and she can intercede on your behalf. And she's also canonized. She is also made a saint. She appears in 1429 as the English seem to have the upper hand in the war. And she's an enigmatic figure of a female. She's a warrior saint. And after Agincourt, England's moving through France, and many are turning and running, and many believe that the war was actually about to be over, and they laid siege to a town called Orleans. And that's that bottom left picture there at the battle of the siege of Orleans in 1429. And there's this idea that whoever won this battle was going to win the war. So at age 13, Joan of Arc in 1425, she received visions of saints who instructed her to come to rescue Orleans and to crown the king at Rheims, which was actually under English control during this time period. And that's in this vicinity right here. This is English. There's the Battle of Agincourt right there. So in 1429, she was granted an audience with Charles II, who is now the King of France, because they're running out of things to do and they need to figure out something. and she impressed him. She showed that she was devoted to him, and he concludes somehow that God sent her, and so she was given command of 7 to 8,000 men and a suit of armor and a sword, and she marched to Orleans. She assaults the town with brilliance and inspires the French forces, and her charisma really shines. And one of the reasons why she's followed in France is because there's this tradition in French of female seers, seers, in the sense that women who see the future and women who talk to God. This is a very Catholic country by this time period, right? Um, and so she has that going for her. She's young, and it's peculiar for men to look on a woman who's not only dressed as a man but dressed in armor, and she spoke French. So on May the 8th, she drove the English back and then pressed on to Rheims. And there, she pushed the English back and she crowns Charles as the king in Rheims like her vision told her to, and the tide of the war shifted after the Battle of Orleans. It will last another 20 some years, but the tide had shifted. That's how long this war is. She was very good. She was a very good general, but in the end, what brought her down is she could not take Paris. She tried to take Paris from the British, and she could not. And those around her, especially around the king, were jealous of her. And so they start putting in Charles's mind that perhaps she's actually an agent of the British. And then he begins to wonder if she was divinely sent at all. And then she gets wounded in the battle for Paris, and then she gets taken prisoner for a year. And eventually, she will be found guilty of heresy by the French Inquisition, and they argue that she was making up her visions. So on May 30th, 1431, she will be burned at the stake in Rouen for being a witch. However, she dies kind of in ignominy, but there is no question that she turned the tide of the war. Then what happens after her death is in 1435, the Duke of Burgundy, which you can see the Duchy of Burgundy, he stopped allying himself with England after he saw where the war was going to go. So what he does is this was a major blow to the British, and by 1435 also they're running out of men, they're running out of motivation, and they're running out of money. And so the British actually begin to sue for peace, and they sue for peace in 1453. What will end up happening to the Duchy of Burgundy actually is it doesn't ally itself with France, but once the war is over, it helps France win the war because they stop fighting the French, and the English don't have too much of a ally within France. But what happens to it after the war is Charles the Bold dies, and his daughter comes to power, and she is his only heir, and she cannot save the Duchy of Burgundy from being swallowed up by France. So in 1453, you can see that you have on the bottom right, you have the Duchy of Burgundy and Flanders. Both of these kind of remain independent from France, even though they kind of helped the French win. They kind of helped the British for a while too. They just were kind of sitting on the sidelines and helping who they thought was going to win. But the Duchy of Burgundy will eventually be swallowed up by France in the 1470s. So, what is the legacy of the 100 Years' War? there's a couple of them, but the first is that it changed the nature of warfare. At its start, the chronicler Jean Froissart considered that it was going to be a chivalric adventure, right? And everybody was expecting to display the gallantry and bravery of the medieval nobility. But he quickly noticed right away in the fighting that most of the men going to war were not nobles at the beginning. In fact, most of them weren't even ordinary foot soldiers either. Rather, they were mercenaries and men who fought for pay and plunder. They did not care which king they were fighting for, they just wanted to get paid. And it was also clear right away that during the lulls in the war, they lived off the French countryside, terrorized the peasants, and exacted quote unquote protection money from the peasants as well. But as the war progressed, and you can't pay mercenaries to fight a 100-year war, as the war progresses, it's not so much men on horses and armor fighting each other like people thought it was, but rather what it turns to is foot soldiers and archers. With the archers, the French used the crossbow, which had heavy, deadly armies, and it was quite accurate, and it was released by a mechanism that even a townsman could master. So the crossbow becomes more accurate than any other bow and arrow up to that time period. Now, on the other side, the English employed what is called a longbow, which could shoot 5 arrows for every one launched with the crossbow. It just wasn't as accurate, but the longbows, because they're so long, could shoot for a very, very long distance as well. And the English become very good at this. The best archers in the world are fighting this war. Meanwhile, gunpowder was also slowly being introduced, and there were cannons forged. So this is the first war where you actually have real sieges of cities, bombarding, but not at a high level, but it definitely occurs. And also, because of gunpowder, handguns were beginning to be used. However, their effect was about the same to that of a crossbow, because they were fairly accurate, but they weren't rifled. They were just muskets, and it took so long to load and reload that a longbow could shoot more and be more accurate from a longer distance than a handgun. So those were important aspects of the 100 Years' War. Not only that, England's kicked off the continent. The warfare changes, and it's going to keep changing. But perhaps most importantly, we also get social changes as well because of the war and because of the plague. So what happens is you get a changing society, and a lot of this turns to chaos. France kind of leads in the area of anarchy or of rebellions because not only was there a 100-year war, but there was plague running through it as well. You get inflation, strikes, unrest, and political instability, and really the entire world changed. Then, once the plague leaves, it actually comes back in 1361 and 62, not with as much force, and in 1369 as well. And really, it does take two and a half centuries for Europe to really get back its population. But kind of anarchy ensues in a lot of places, even after the plague was gone. These weird and eccentric societies start forming because of the loss of faith in the world. You get things like the Brethren of Free Speech, who claim to be in a state of grace, so they could do whatever they wanted to. Adultery, free love, public nudity, even kill people. It's just this idea that I can do whatever I want because it doesn't matter anymore. So I should mention what being in a state of grace means is that you're in a friendship with God, and you're close to God. So it's a condition of being free from sin, right? And there's also this fact that many people were mad at the clergy and the clerics because you basically had two choices if you're the clergy. Either you stayed in the city and you died helping them, or you fled to rural areas and you locked yourself in an abbey or a monastery and didn't let anyone in and hope it passed. Some did the first, some did the latter. And so people remember those kinds of things for the people who did the latter. You also get this group called the Flagellants, who, if any of you have seen the Dan Brown movie or read the Da Vinci Code, this is this sect of Catholicism who beat themselves mercilessly because of the sin. So these are the people who are going around saying, the reason why we did this is because why the plague happened is because God was angry at us because we were sinners and we aren't repentant enough. And so, they would beat themselves till they were bloody and other people in order to be closer to God and to ask Him for forgiveness. And really, there is just, as religion, there's just people lose faith. And the church also needs to rebuild itself. Not only to say that, hey, we lived through it and things of that nature, but also to help the poor. And so what the church really begins to count on to make money are things called indulgences. And basically indulgences were a declaration by church authorities that those who say certain prayers or do good deeds, such as give offering, will have some or all of their punishment in purgatory remitted. Basically meaning, if you want to be forgiven, then help the church out or do good deeds. And so you have this starting to happen as well, come to the forefront, which will be important later when we talk about Martin Luther King. I'm sorry, not Martin Luther King, just Martin Luther. I was talking about Martin Luther King today. Sorry about that. And the feudal order is undermined. Peasants had occasionally erupted since Roman times, but these begin to be large-scale insurrections, and massive revolts break out both in France and England. Not only because people are taxing more because there's just not enough money, but also they just cannot keep the marauding bands from coming in, and society was breaking down. There's just this complete lack of societal structure after the plague and during the 100 Years' War. And so the first real peasant rebellion comes in France around 1358. I love that picture. They're throwing the nobles in the water. And it's a term derived from Jacques Bonhomme, meaning Jacques Goodfellow. And so what peasants do is they arm themselves with knives and staves because of the anarchy, and they rampage the land. They kill nobles. They kill higher clergy. They burn. They loot all the property they could. However, Jacques Goodfellow, even though it was quite violent and the peasants really were fairly organized, the King of France and the aristocrats and the church got together that same year and they ruthlessly put it down, killing thousands upon thousands of people, saying, you cannot do this. And it really drives the protest underground. However, it's just one small example of kind of the anarchy that's occurring, and the peasants are really using this as a way to try to change their station in life in France. You get the same thing in England. It's just a little later, and it was much more organized. The Black Death and the 100-Year War drastically cut the labor supply in England, resulting in peasants' demands for higher wages and fewer manorial obligations. Now this, in 1351, before 1381, is countered by the Statute of Laborers. And this was a law that came from the king that froze wages, meaning you couldn't raise them. You couldn't lower them either, but you couldn't raise them. That froze wages and bound workers to their manners, meaning you can't you're going to have, everywhere you go, you're going to have a piece of paper that says, here's who owns me, here's where I come from, so on and so forth. Right. It could not be enforced. Obviously, you can't enforce things like that. But there is no doubt that a huge gap remained between the peasants and their lords. And this was very much the case in the south of England, where the revolt broke out, and there was little protection for the aristocrats and the nobles, and even the king, for that matter, during this revolt that occurs, because most of the people who would be putting down this insurrection are fighting a war, right? They're in France. However, it didn't really get real nasty. This is in like the late 1350s. The revolt eventually ends and it gets put down. It just was violent. It bred hostility and bitterness in between the aristocrats and the peasants even more, if that was possible. However, things go away for about 20 years, but in 1380, and late 1380, early 1381, because the king needs to fund the 100 Years' War, he reintroduces a tax on all adult males. And despite widespread opposition from all kinds of people, nobles and the peasants, the king orders the royal council to make sure that sheriffs go and collect taxes. And this begins in the early parts of 1381, and this began a major uprising called the English Peasants' Revolt. And there's another picture of nobles getting killed by peasants. This involved thousands of people. It begins with an assault on the tax collectors, and it followed the earlier Jacquerie in 1358, in that the Peasants' Revolt attacked castles and manors, and they were sacked. Manorial records were destroyed, so you couldn't say who owned who and who owned what land and so on and so forth. You couldn't prove any of those. And many nobles, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, were murdered. And the center of the revolt lay in the highly populated and economically advanced southern cities of Britain, England, which we know of as kind of London today. And so how it stops is the boy king, Richard II, met the leaders of the revolt, and he agrees to a charter ensuring their freedom, meaning no longer are you tied to the land where you were born, no longer does the feudal system work, rather you were born a man and you can go and work wherever you want to. But really what happens is he tricked them into stopping, and then crushes the uprising with terrible ferocity. And in the aftermath, I'm sorry, this picture is not of nobles killing peasants. This picture is of the nobles going after peasants, and it's kind of the signal of the end of the peasant revolt. In the aftermath, there was not social equality in Britain, but rural serfdom continued to decline, and it will disappear by 1550 in Britain. So that's kind of the chaos that's occurring because of the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. But things are also changing as far as sexuality and crime on the European continent. The rebellions were clearly of an economic basis, but some people argue that marital patterns had something to do with the rebellions as well, especially in northwestern Europe, because like we kind of discussed earlier, there is this idea that you have to be economically independent before you were married. Thus, in times of crisis, Men and women spent long periods as servants or workers in other households. Then they saved money and they learned skills. Or, like we talked about with the aristocrats, if you were a noble, you had to wait until your parents died. So for women, this meant the unusual idea that they were kind of beginning to be married later in life by the 1400s. Um, by this time, it was an adult in her early to mid 20s. That's the average of when a woman was married, not 16 anymore. And she took charge of running the household right away. She was thus not completely dependent on her husband or her mother-in-law, because by this time she had made some money, she had gained some skills, and she understood how the world worked, and she brought her own money into the household. She also had fewer pregnancies because she was older when she got married, which meant that she had a chance of living longer, because pregnancies and going through childbirth was so dangerous back then. I mean, it still is, not easy by any stretch of the imagination. Um, but you had a chance to live longer the less you were pregnant. Now, men of all social groups tended to be older, in their middle to late 20s when they got married, whether high class or lower class, with wealthier urban dwellers getting married later in their late 20s. Journeymen and apprentices, carpenters, artisans, clay makers, whatever, were forbidden to get married, as were many college students until they were done with their studies, and because they understood that they needed to study and finish their studies first before they got married. This meant that there was a large number of young men who had no family responsibilities, meaning when you have young men who don't have responsibilities, you have family responsibilities, you have more unrest. Not to mention, this will quickly lead to a rising number of what will become known as the world's oldest profession. Um, Prostitution flourishes in Europe during this time period. Um, and I'll use a small sample, a case study, of a southern French province of Languedoc in the 14th and 15th century. And what happens here, as in a lot of other places, but we're using this as a case study, is that it becomes legal. You get legal brothels, in this whole region, in most cities in this region, and it was either outside the city walls, or they created districts away from respectable neighborhoods. There are actual streets that are for prostitutes and brothels only. What this did is it kept them in one place, and it also kept them safe from molestation because you had a police presence there at all times. And so what this does is it kind of what Europe decides is, well, it's a social problem. It's a social matter now. So now it requires public supervision. No longer can you just live in the shadows. It's so prevalent that we have to do something about it. For men, this was seen as your right as becoming a man, right? Going to see a prostitute, because you're not going to get married till your early 20s. So this is kind of how many men, quote unquote, became a man, which is back then thinking. But for women, obviously, it was work. Some women had no choice. Some were sold by their parents or some other person as payment for debt. Most of them became indebted to their brothel owners because of their clothes and other items, and lodging and food and other items of their occupation was usually more than the money that they made doing their jobs. Um, Now, it was legal in a lot of places and cities, but a lot of times there were still people doing it illegally, especially poor women and men who would do this illegally outside of brothels, because they had a job sewing or laundry or cleaning stalls or doing something, and that didn't make enough money, so they had to become prostitutes as well to supplement their income. Um, and usually, from what they can gather, is mostly a city thing, because in cities you have a large population of young men, you have transient merchants, you have money, and you have a culture that's accustomed to cash exchange. In the countryside, in a lot of these areas, it was more like bartering. I'll work for 4 days. You give me this much hay, etc., this much food, and so on and so forth. Cash transactions aren't as prevalent, in rural areas as they are in city areas. Now, the status of a prostitute, although it was legal, your position in society was always marginal, and they were limited to freedom of movement and choice of clothing. Many towns make them wear distinctive head coverings or bands on their clothes to say, this is what I am. They also begin to impose really harsh penalties on those doing it illegally, and most remained in the more poor side of things. So even though it was legal, and even though everybody knew that everybody was doing it, you were still a prostitute, and that was your status, and you were a woman. Male prostitution was not legal during this time period, not to say that it didn't occur, but that's just how it went. Now, other relations. Um, Unmarried women often found themselves with employers or their sons or their male relatives who could coerce them, or force them or seduce them, into sexual relations, especially those who worked in proximity of these men. And here's a great painting of this. However, notions of female honor kept many upper class women in the home, oftentimes secluded. But there was little to no attempt to help lower class women, um, to help keep them from the risk of rape or seduction. In your last book, you'll read about the Burgermeister's daughter, who they try to seclude, and she does not want that. It's very scandalous. However, rape was a capital crime in many parts of Europe, meaning if you were found guilty, you would be killed. But the actual sentences handed out were more likely to be fines and brief imprisonment, with the severity of imprisonment depending on social status. Now, according to the laws, the victim had to prove that she cried out and that she had attempted to repel the attacker. And then she had to bring it to court as soon as possible, and then the proceedings would start. So if you can prove those, which means that people were around, which means it would be very hard to do, because usually most rapes don't occur in that type of environment. And this was just as much an honor thing for women as well, because they knew that men were probably only going to be fined or going to go to prison. But it was just this idea that they have to be put, they have to, something has to happen to them. It has been found in the records that, many of the women who came to who came to charge men for rape actually ended up marrying that man, which is kind of interesting, right? Um, so take what you want with that. Now, same-sex relations were commonplace, and they were actually of little concern to the church or the state in the early Middle Ages, but in the late 20th century, this changes. By 1300, most areas had defined same-sex relations as crimes against nature, with authorities seeing them as particularly reprehensible because, they thought that it did not occur anywhere else in creation, and there's the idea that you are not procreating, right? Usually this was termed sodomy, and this also became a capital crime in many places, with many cities creating their own courts that saw thousands of investigations and court cases, based on this. So the question is how prevalent, and that's very difficult to answer. But a study of Florence during this time period is another good case study. So in 1432, the Florentians, is that how you say it? Florentians set up a board of adult men called the Office of the Knight to root out the quote-unquote abominable sodomy. So for 70 years, from 1432 to 1502, this Office of the Knight ran, and about 17,000 men came to their attention, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that represents an enormous amount of the population, because in 1502, the total male population of Florence was only 40,000 people. However, looking at the records, almost all involved an adult man and an adolescent boy, and it ranged from sex for money or gifts, which is prostitution, to force, which is rape, to actual long-term affairs, or they were lovers. So, but what this does show is it was not a marginal practice, which may mean that even though there was a court, very few men were actually put in jail for it. There is no idea. There are no records about women, because it almost never came to the officials, so I have a hard time saying how much, but it obviously occurred. And there are songs and plays and stories that point to their happenings. It's just they were more worried with the men's side as opposed to the women's side. So there aren't very good records of that. Lastly, kind of an interesting, and this will be it for the week, an interesting kind of social facet to this all was and will be the cause for one of the most famous popular figures of this time period is a thing called fur collar crime. What happens is the 100 Years' War had provided opportunity and employment for thousands of idle and fortune-seeking knights, men that we talked about last week or the week before. But during times of truce, they had little to do, and inflation hurt them. And although they did have little money, chivalry demanded lavish generosity and an aristocratic lifestyle. So they turned to crime to raise money. And so the 14th and 15th century really witnessed much of this, and it's kind of like a medieval version of today's white-collar crime, in which those who are less well off fall prey to those above them, or it was the aristocrats and the knights take advantage of the aristocrats. And it involved both violence and fraud. So basically, groups of bandits, especially in England, roamed the countryside, stealing from both the rich and the poor. And so they kind of operated like a modern urban racketeers. These gangs would demand pay for protection money, or else if you were a peasant, your hovel would be burned, or your field would be destroyed, or even if you were a manor, an aristocrat or a noble, they'd threaten your manor. They seized wealthy travelers and held them for ransom. They went after corrupt landowners, some being churchmen. They would steal from them as well. So no one was really free. But then when they were accused of wrongdoing, they would intimidate witnesses, they would threaten jurors, and they'd use influence to persuade judges to support them, or they just flat out bribed them. And so what comes out of these fur collar crimes, are ballads and poems and songs and plays about men like Robin Hood. A folk legend describing the adventures of the outlaw hero, avenging the common people against those grasping landlords, those wicked sheriffs, and those mercenary churchmen. Right? This is Robin Hood and his merry men, right? And he becomes so popular even back then because he symbolized the deep resentment of aristocratic corruption and abuse, and he was a man who struggled against tyranny and oppression. So, to conclude, we see with the end of the Middle Ages that there is lots of death, rebellion, and corruption. However, we will see that wealth, especially in Italy, and the drive for education that comes out of this period will start a rebirth in Europe, and we will discuss that next week. So that's your PowerPoint for the week. Please let me know if you have any questions at all.